When we think about the hazards of substance misuse, um, our minds tend to conjure up a very specific, almost cinematic set of images.
Right, the classic shadowy stereotype.
Exactly. We picture shadowed street corners at midnight, or, I don't know, hidden laboratories, complex international supply chains,
Yeah.
or at the very least, a locked medicine cabinet. We expect the danger to look dangerous. But what if the threat isn't lurking in the shadows?
What if it's right in front of you?
Right. What if it's just sitting there, completely ignored, hiding in plain sight? Imagine for a moment walking into your kitchen and opening the cabinet under the sink.
Uh-huh.
Or looking at a dusty, sort of disorganized shelf in your garage. You see a tube of contact adhesive, a tin of paint thinner, maybe some aerosol hairspray or bottle of lighter fluid.
The can of air duster you bought for your keyboard?
Yes, exactly. These are ordinary, banal household items. They are products, not illicit drugs. But to a vulnerable mind, these everyday items act as a master of disguise. There's no shadowy dealer required, no dark web transaction, no complex criminal network. It's just everyday chemistry waiting to be profoundly misunderstood. So, welcome to the deep dive.
It is a remarkable and tragic paradox, isn't it? I mean, the very ordinary nature of these products is exactly what makes them so extraordinarily dangerous.
Yeah.
Particularly to the young people who most frequently misuse them. We are looking at a class of substances that entirely bypasses all our usual societal alarms.
Because you wouldn't leave a bottle of gin sitting on a primary school desk.
Never, or a packet of prescription opioids, but you wouldn't think twice about a permanent marker, would you? Or a bottle of correction fluid.
Exactly. And our mission for this deep dive is to investigate the profound medical and psychiatric impact of inhalant-related disorders.
Right.
We're going to use the core concepts from Kaplan and Sadok's comprehensive textbook of psychiatry, specifically Chapter 11.7, as our structural spine.
It's a brilliant framework for this.
Yeah, it really is. We're going to trace the journey of these chemicals from the hardware store shelf, through the lungs, and deep into the microscopic cellular structures of the brain. So, okay, let's unpack this.
Let's do it.
Before we get into the molecules, the receptors, the diagnostic criteria, we really need to anchor ourselves. Why does this matter so much in a clinical setting? Like, how should a clinician or just a curious learner listening to us right now frame this issue?
Well, to frame this accurately for you, the listener, we have to start with a core anchor of the profession.
Okay.
Psychiatry, at its very foundation, is the study of how the brain, the mind, and human experience interact.
Right.
And critically, how that beautiful, complex process can go wrong.
Right, when the system breaks down.
Exactly. And inhalants are arguably the most perfect, tragic example of this breakdown. You have a seemingly harmless experience, say a teenager inhaling the fumes of a spray can in their bedroom, that catastrophically and rapidly disrupts both the physical brain and the psychological mind. We are not just talking about a fleeting high or a transient state of intoxication. We are talking about profound structural neurotoxicity.
It's essentially a chemical invasion of the central nervous system, facilitated by household chores.
That's a very good way to put it, yeah.
I want to start by looking at what we might call the epidemiology of the ordinary. The statistics from longitudinal studies, like the Monitoring the Future surveys, are genuinely staggering.
They really are.
They report that nearly 10% of 8th graders, so we're talking about children who are 13 or 14 years old, report lifetime use of inhalants.
10%.
Yeah. That places inhalants in 4th place for this specific age group, sitting only behind alcohol, marijuana, and cigarettes.
Which is a terrifying metric.
It is. When you see that it's the 8th graders, you have to ask, why this specific age group? Why are young, early adolescents so incredibly vulnerable to these specific substances?
Well, it essentially comes down to a multifactorial etiology. It's a perfect storm of environmental access and developmental vulnerability. First and foremost, you have absolute availability. These products are cheap, they are completely legal to purchase and possess, and they are omnipresent. They are in almost every home, every school supply closet, and every corner shop.
You literally can't ban them without banning modern life.
Precisely. Second, they are incredibly easy to conceal. To use them, you don't need a pipe, a syringe, rolling papers, nothing like that.
Right.
You just need a sleeve, a plastic bag, or just the container itself. And third, the intoxication profile is incredibly rapid.
Because it hits the brain so fast.
Exactly. The high comes on in seconds or minutes, and it can dissipate almost as quickly if they stop inhaling.
Which makes it an absolute nightmare for parents or teachers trying to spot it.
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, a kid could get high in a bathroom stall during a break and walk back into a maths class seemingly sober a short time later.
That happens all the time. It allows youth to evade detection. But to your point about why this age group, early adolescence, is a period of massive psychosocial transition and brain development.
Right, the teenager brain.
Exactly. The prefrontal cortex, which governs impulse control and risk assessment, is still under construction, so to speak, while the reward centers of the brain are highly active. So when you combine high impulsivity, easy access, and a lack of immediate detection, you get this massive spike in early adolescent use.
It makes me think of an opportunistic infection in medicine.
Oh, that's an interesting analogy.
Well, an opportunistic infection doesn't usually bother a healthy host, right?
Yeah.
It thrives where the immune system is already compromised.
Yes, exactly.
And in this case, inhalant misuse seems to thrive where the social and familial support system is compromised. It's not just kids experimenting in a vacuum, is it?
No, not at all.
Can we explore the comorbidity and the demographics we see in these early users? Like, what else is going on in their lives?
The analogy of an opportunistic infection is highly accurate here, because while many youths might experiment once or twice out of sheer curiosity and then just stop, the ones who continue...
Right, ones who get hooked.
Right. The ones who progress to develop a severe inhalant use disorder, they are very often carrying a heavy burden of psychosocial compromise.
What kind of burden?
Well, the clinical data shows a very high comorbidity with conduct disorder and early onset antisocial personality traits. We also see elevated rates of comorbid mood and anxiety disorders and deeply, deeply concerning rates of suicidality.
Wow. So the inhalant use is often a symptom of a much larger systemic distress.
Absolutely. Furthermore, a history of physical or sexual abuse or profound neglect is frequently present in the clinical history of chronic inhalant users.
That's heartbreaking.
It is. Inhalant use is very often a glaring, flashing marker for profound marginalization. It is a child seeking chemical dissociation from an environment that simply feels intolerable.
And that marginalization plays out on a global and demographic scale, doesn't it? Like, it's not evenly distributed across the population.
Not at all. Globally, we see extremely high prevalence among unhoused youth.
Right.
If you look at children living on the streets in loose-knit gangs in developing nations, inhalant use, often glue sniffing, is actually a socially acceptable, even integrated way to cope with trauma, chronic hunger, and the cold.
It blunts the physical reality of living on the street.
Exactly. And even within developed nations, we see it cluster in specific, isolated, and historically disadvantaged communities.
Like where?
For instance, in certain Native American or indigenous communities, the odds of initiation can be double that of comparable Caucasian youth.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. It speaks to a deep need for focused, culturally aware interventions. The root cause isn't just the presence of a tin of paint, It's the environment of despair, poverty, or isolation that makes the chemical escape so appealing in the first place.
That makes perfect sense.
Yeah.
But here's where it gets really interesting, and honestly, something I found deeply unsettling in the epidemiological data.
What's that?
Well, if you look at the longitudinal trends, lifetime use actually showed periods of decline between 2005 and 2019.
Right, we did see a dip.
Yeah, so on paper, you might think, great, public health interventions worked, we solved it.
Yeah.
But the surveys noted a terrifying parallel trend. The perceived harmfulness of inhalants is dropping sharply.
Yes.
Fewer kids today think it's dangerous to try it once or twice. Why is the fear disappearing?
This is a phenomenon sociologists and public health experts call generational forgetting.
Generational forgetting.
Yes. So in the mid-1990s through the early 2000s, there was a massive, highly visible public health campaign in many countries warning about the dangers of huffing.
I remember those.
Right.
Yeah.
There were television adverts, school assemblies, really graphic warnings, and it worked. Usage rates dropped significantly.
Yeah.
But because it worked, the campaigns were eventually discontinued. Funding moved to other emerging crises, like the opioid epidemic.
So we essentially became victims of our own success.
Exactly. Now, a completely new generation of youths has grown up without ever seeing those warnings. They are entirely unaware of the extreme dangers, and so they're effectively rediscovering these toxic substances.
Because it's just lying around.
Right. They perceive them as harmless because, well, it's just computer duster, isn't it? It's just a marker pen. How bad could it possibly be?
Yeah.
There is no inherent danger signal attached to a can of whipped cream propellant.
Wow. Okay, to understand exactly how bad it can be, we need to shift our focus. We need to move from the societal level down to the cellular level.
Let's do it.
Let's trace the physical journey of these chemicals, pharmacokinetics. Once a young person makes the decision to inhale, I want to paint the picture here.
Okay.
Someone is huffing from a soaked rag held to their face, or bagging by inhaling from a plastic bag filled with fumes, or dusting by spraying an aerosol directly into their mouth.
Right.
They might take, say, 50 to 20 deep breaths. Now, I think a lot of people operate on a very basic, naive assumption about breathing. You'd think you inhale a foreign gas and then you just breathe it back out and it's gone.
That's the logical assumption, yes.
Right. No harm, no foul. But it doesn't work that way with these solvents, does it?
It absolutely does not, and that misunderstanding is exactly where the acute neural toxicity begins. Think about the route of administration here. The human lungs.
Okay.
The lungs are a highly efficient, incredibly massive surface area. I mean, if you flattened out all the alveoli, it would cover a tennis court.
A whole tennis court.
Yeah. And this system is exquisitely designed for one thing: rapid, frictionless gas exchange directly into the bloodstream.
Right. Getting oxygen in, carbon dioxide out.
Exactly. So when a volatile hydrocarbon like toluene, which is the classic prototypical solvent found in glue and paint, enters those alveolar spaces, it doesn't just sit there.
What happens?
It is absorbed almost instantly. It saturates the pulmonary blood and is immediately pumped by the left side of the heart straight up to the central nervous system.
The speed is terrifying. It's just a direct highway to the brain.
A completely unobstructed highway.
But let's talk about the sheer volume of the chemical they are being exposed to. The literature gives us some numbers that are just, well, they're mind-boggling when you compare them to industrial safety standards.
The contrast is genuinely staggering. Let's look at an occupational setting, right? Imagine a factory where adult workers are exposed to toluene as part of the manufacturing process.
Like making paint or something.
Exactly. The safety standard maximum in many jurisdictions is 100 parts per million, or ppm, averaged over an 8-hour workday.
100 ppm for adults over 8 hours.
Right. And even at that strictly controlled, low level, workers can still show minor cognitive decrements and fatigue.
Wow.
Now compare that to a teenager who is bagging toluene. The estimates suggest they are inhaling concentrations between 5,000 to 15,000 ppm within a matter of minutes.
Wait, 15,000. So they are taking in 150 times the daily industrial safety limit in the space of, what, 3 pop songs?
Yes, it is a massive, overwhelming chemical flood. The brain is entirely defenseless against that concentration gradient.
And once it's in the blood, where does it go? Why does it target the brain so aggressively?
Because there's a biological concept that is crucial here, the lipophilicity.
Can you break down what that means for the listener? Why does the fat-loving nature of these chemicals spell absolute disaster for the human brain?
Of course. So lipophilicity literally translates to fat-loving. It means a chemical has a strong affinity for lipids or fats. It dissolves seamlessly into fat, much like oil dissolving into oil, whereas it completely repels water.
Okay.
Why does this matter in psychiatry and neurology? Because the human brain is an incredibly fat-rich organ.
Right.
Specifically, I want you to think about the myelin sheaths. These are the protective, insulating layers that wrap around the axons of our neurons.
It's like the rubber coating on an electrical wire.
Exactly. They make up the brain's white matter and are essential for the rapid transmission of electrical signals. And these myelin sheaths are composed largely of lipids.
So the brain is essentially a giant lipid sponge waiting for a lipophilic chemical.
That's exactly what it is. Because solvents like toluene are highly lipophilic. They cross the blood-brain barrier with zero resistance. The barrier barely registers them.
You just waves them right through.
Pretty much. And once inside, they preferentially accumulate or pool in this lipid-rich white matter as well as in adipose tissue, so fat tissue around the rest of the body.
Wow.
And here is the critical pharmacokinetic trap.
Yeah.
Because it accumulates in the fat, it doesn't just wash out of the system in a few hours like alcohol might.
It stays there.
Yes. Autoradiography studies, which track radiolabeled chemicals in the body, show that while toluene clears the bloodstream relatively quickly, it lingers stubbornly in the brain and body fat for days.
For days. So you have this simple molecule, toluene. I mean, it's literally just a benzene ring with a single methyl group attached. It's incredibly simple chemistry,
Very simple.
and it's just soaking into the white matter of the brain. But it isn't just sitting there passively taking up space, is it? It's actively sabotaging the receptor networks.
Yes, it is.
I always used to imagine inhalants acting like a non-specific sledgehammer, just, shutting the brain down through the sheer toxic weight of the fumes. But the pharmacodynamics show it's actually much more targeted than that.
That sledgehammer theory was actually the common medical consensus for a very long time. We assumed it just disrupted the cell membranes nonspecifically. But as neuropharmacological research has advanced, we found that inhalants, despite their incredibly simple chemical structures, exhibit distinct receptor selectivity.
They're hacking the system.
They're actively hacking into very specific neurochemical networks. Let's look at 3 primary targets, starting with dopamine.
The classic reward chemical.
Exactly. Toluene exposure produces marked, rapid increases in extracellular dopamine levels within the striatum and the ventral tegmental area, or the VTA.
Right, the VTA.
The VTA is the beating heart of the brain's reward circuitry. By triggering dopamine release here, the inhalant provides a massive artificial reinforcement signal. It chemically tells the brain, this is fundamentally important for survival, do this again.
Even though it's literally poison.
Right.
Yeah.
And this is what drives the profound reinforcing properties and the high addiction potential.
Okay, so that explains the addictive drive, the craving to huff again. But dopamine doesn't explain the actual state of intoxication.
No, it doesn't.
It doesn't explain the slurring, the stumbling, the eventual blackout. Where does that come from?
That depressant effect comes from how toluene interacts with 2 other major neurotransmitter systems, glutamate and GABA.
Okay, let's break those down.
Sure. Glutamate is the brain's primary excitatory neurotransmitter. It turns things on, speeds things up. GABA, on the other hand, is the brain's primary inhibitory neurotransmitter. It turns things off, calms things down.
Got it.
So toluene acts as a non-competitive inhibitor at the NMDA receptor, which is a key glutamate receptor. In simple functional terms, it blocks the brain's excitatory signals.
It shuts down the go signal.
Yes. And simultaneously, toluene acts as a positive allosteric modulator at the GABA receptor. This means it binds to the GABA receptor and significantly enhances its inhibitory, depressing effect.
I used to think of this as simultaneously cutting the brake lines and flooring the accelerator, but that analogy is completely backwards if we're talking about a depressant.
It is backwards, yeah.
A better way to picture it is that you are taking your foot entirely off the accelerator pedal, that's the glutamate blockade, while simultaneously slamming on the emergency brake with both hands. That's the GABA enhancement.
That is a perfect analogy. You are halting forward momentum and forcefully inducing a stop.
Wow.
This dual mechanism antagonizing NMDA and potentiating GABA creates a classic central nervous system depressant profile. It is pharmacologically very similar to the mechanism of action of alcohol barbiturates or benzodiazepines.
Which explains the overlap in symptoms.
Exactly. You get the initial disinhibition and euphoria because you are suppressing the inhibitory control centers of the frontal lobe first, but that is followed rapidly by ataxia, motor dysfunction, and eventually profound CNS depression, narcosis, and if the dose is high enough, general anesthesia and coma.
It's just shutting the whole system down. But the damage isn't just about receptors turning on and off, is it? I mean, receptors can reset. With inhalants, there is a brutal physical assault happening at the cellular level.
A very literal destruction, yes.
We aren't just altering signals, we are destroying the hardware. The literature dives into concepts like intracellular oxidative stress and lipid peroxidation. For the curious learner who might not have looked at a biochemistry textbook in a while, how exactly are these solvents destroying the brain cells?
Let's break down that jargon because it's important. When the body tries to metabolize or break down these volatile organic compounds, the chemical reactions generate what we call reactive oxygen species, or ROS.
Okay.
These are highly unstable, aggressive molecules that are essentially missing an electron. To stabilize themselves, they violently rip electrons away from other molecules in the cell. Now, remember what we said about the brain being full of lipids?
Right. The myelin sheath is entirely fat.
Exactly. So these reactive oxygen species indiscriminately attack the phospholipid bilayers, the actual structural lipid membranes that hold the brain cells together. This process is called lipid peroxidation.
Wow.
I want you to picture a structural fire inside a building, slowly weakening the steel beams. The cells are literally rusting or burning from the inside out.
That's a horrifying image.
It is. The membranes tear apart. This massive oxidative stress triggers a cascade that leads to apoptosis, which is programmed cell death, and causes severe DNA fragmentation. The brain cells are being chemically shredded.
It's an incredibly violent microscopic picture.
Mm.
So we have chemicals crossing the blood-brain barrier instantly, hacking the reward and inhibitory networks, and actively dissolving the white matter through oxidative stress.
Yeah.
If this is the microscopic destruction, what does this actually look like macroscopically? When this patient, this teenager, ends up in the A&E or the psychiatric clinic, what are the clinical manifestations we actually see?
Let's start with acute intoxication. If you're assessing a patient in the emergency department, the clinical criteria for inhalant intoxication looks superficially very much like severe alcohol intoxication.
Okay, so they look drunk.
Exactly. You will see dizziness, slurred speech, an unsteady ataxic gait, lethargy, depressed reflexes, and periods of euphoria.
Are there any specific signs that point to inhalants over alcohol?
A key clinical sign to look for is nystagmus, the involuntary rapid flickering of the eyes when they track an object. In higher doses, as the CNS depression deepens, you will see stupor, visual and auditory hallucinations, and illusions.
But unlike alcohol, there's an acute, terrifying risk that hangs over every single inhalation event, even the very first time a kid tries it.
Yes.
The medical literature refers to it as sudden sniffing death. How does someone go from inhaling a solvent to sudden cardiac arrest in a matter of seconds?
Sudden sniffing death is a catastrophic cardiac event, and it is arguably the most acute danger of inhalant misuse. The mechanism is fascinating and highly lethal. We know that these halogenated hydrocarbons heavily sensitize the myocardium, the heart muscle itself, to endogenous catecholamines like epinephrine, which we commonly call adrenaline.
So the heart becomes hypersensitive to the body's own adrenaline.
Precisely. So picture the scenario. A teenager inhales a solvent, and their heart muscle becomes highly sensitized and electrically unstable.
Right.
Then something happens that causes an adrenaline spike.
Like what?
Maybe a parent suddenly knocks on the bedroom door. Maybe a police officer shines a flashlight into a parked car. Or maybe the teenager just engages in sudden, vigorous physical exertion like jumping a fence to run away.
Just a normal fight-or-flight response.
Exactly. The brain naturally dumps adrenaline into the system in response to the startle or the exertion. The highly sensitized heart overreacts to this normal adrenaline surge, and it instantly goes into a fatal ventricular arrhythmia.
Just instant.
Yes. The heart loses its coordinated rhythm, it fibrillates, fails to pump blood, and the user collapses, often dying before paramedics can even be dispatched.
That's truly terrifying because it's so unpredictable. And that's just one way acute intoxication can be fatal. The literature also notes suffocation from bagging.
Yes, where a user passes out with the plastic bag still sealed over their head, asphyxiating themselves.
Or aspiration, where the CNS depression is so deep they lose their gag reflex and literally drown in their own vomit.
Also very common, sadly.
And there's also a horrific physical trauma risk with specific products, like if a user inhales a highly pressurized gas like butane directly from the nozzle.
The physics of that are brutal.
The rapid expansion of the gas causes it to plummet in temperature, right? It literally freezes the vocal cords on contact, causing severe laryngeal edema. The vocal cords swell shut, suffocating the user instantly.
It highlights a crucial point. The mode of administration and the physical properties of the industrial gases themselves are just as dangerous as the neurochemistry. You're putting industrial propellants into delicate respiratory tissue.
Right. So let's transition from the acute crisis to the chronic devastation. The psychiatric texts often include case studies that really bring this home. I recall a particularly sobering one of a 15-year-old boy.
I know the one you mean.
Yeah. He had a severe trauma history, an abusive biologic father, and he started using marijuana at age 10 to get away and blunt his anger. He escalated to multiple substances, was in and out of the juvenile justice system, but eventually ended up in a structured day treatment program.
And outwardly, he was doing well.
Right. He was passing all his routine urine drug screens, engaging in therapy, talking about pro-social goals, but routine standard drug screens don't catch inhalants.
No, they don't.
A week after being praised for his progress by his clinical team, his mother found him fully submerged and unresponsive in a bathtub. He had been huffing an air duster containing a propellant called 11,1-difluorophane, passed out from the CNS depression, and drowned.
It is a devastating clinical vignette because it perfectly illustrates the tragic trajectory we so often see in practice.
It really does.
You have the early trauma, the escalation of substance use as a form of self-medication for underlying conduct and mood issues, the tragic ability to evade detection by the clinical team, and the sudden, fatal consequence.
And for those who survive chronic long-term use without a fatal accident, their bodies become a landscape of toxicological ruin.
They really do. We see severe renal failure due to tubular necrosis, the kidneys literally dying off. We see hepatic failure and liver tumors. We see profound ototoxicity, which manifests as irreversible hearing loss and chronic tinnitus.
Hearing loss from huffing, that's wild.
Yes, and prolonged use of specific inhalants like nitrates or naphthalene actively suppresses the bone marrow.
Let's define that for a moment. When you say it suppresses the bone marrow, we're talking about aplastic anemia, right?
Yes. Aplastic anemia is a condition where your bone marrow just stops producing new blood cells. Red cells, white cells, platelets.
So you lose your immune system and your ability to carry oxygen?
You lose your ability to carry oxygen, fight infection, and clot blood. In severe cases, it can trigger leukemia. The systemic toxicity is immense.
But the most profound damage, given what we discussed earlier about lipophilicity, is in the brain. What does a chronic huffer's brain actually look like on an MRI scanner?
Honestly, it looks like a brain that is suffering from a rapidly progressing chemically induced dementia. The MRI studies are definitive and horrifying to look at, especially in a young person.
What do you see?
We see significant widespread atrophy or shrinkage of cerebral, cerebellar, and brainstem tissue. You see widening of the sulci, meaning the brain tissue is actually shrinking away from the skull, and massive ventricular enlargement as the fluid spaces expand to fill the empty volume left by dead brain tissue. But the most characteristic finding is severe leukoencephalopathy.
Let's break that word down. Leuko meaning white. Encephalopathy meaning brain disease.
Exactly. It is diffuse central nervous system demyelination. The lipid-rich white matter is being destroyed by those reactive oxygen species we discussed to such an extent that radiologists report a total loss of differentiation between the white and gray matter areas on the scan.
That's unbelievable.
The neural connections, the high-speed wiring of the brain are literally melting away.
And clinically, how does that translate to the patient sitting in the exam room? Like, how does that manifest in their behavior and cognition?
It translates into profound, devastating, major neurocognitive disorders. You see severe memory deficits. You see a catastrophic drop in executive functioning, abstract thinking, and information processing. You see speech impairments.
What about physically?
Because of the cerebellar and white matter damage, you see severe ambulatory abnormalities. They literally lose the ability to walk normally or coordinate their limbs. Furthermore, you see severe psychiatric manifestations, drastic personality changes, paranoid psychosis, and a high incidence of temporal lobe epilepsy.
So we are talking about teenagers or young adults in their early 20s presenting with the cognitive and physical profiles of end-stage dementia patients.
Unfortunately, yes.
Which brings us to another highly vulnerable population. The epidemiology data noted something very specific. Female adolescent usage rates have actually surpassed males in some of the recent 8th and 10th grade demographic surveys.
Yes, that's a very concerning trend.
And this intersection of rising female adolescent use and the extreme lipophilic toxicity of solvents leads us to a specific, deeply tragic consequence: fetal solvent syndrome, or FSS.
Yes. We are all generally familiar with the terogenic effects of alcohol, right? Terogenic essentially meaning an agent that disrupts the development of a fetus causing profound developmental injury.
Like fetal alcohol spectrum disorder.
Exactly, FASD. Because inhalants share so many pharmacological similarities with alcohol, specifically that NMDA antagonism and GABA potentiation we discussed, maternal use of solvents during pregnancy produces an embryopathy, a developmental abnormality that is chillingly similar to FASD.
Because it just crosses the placenta.
The high concentrations of toluene found in maternal tissue cross the placenta effortlessly and accumulate in the fetal tissue, particularly the rapidly developing lipid-rich fetal brain.
What are the physical and developmental manifestations of fetal solvent syndrome when the child is born?
Infants are often born prematurely with significant developmental delays. Physically, they exhibit microcephaly, an abnormally small head and brain. They frequently have a hypoplastic midface, which is a medical way of saying the center of the face, around the nose, and upper jaw is underdeveloped.
Okay.
You also see thin upper lips, short palpebral fissures around the eyes, and low-set ears.
And what about long-term?
Long-term follow-up of these children shows moderate growth retardation, severe cerebellar dysfunction leading to lifelong coordination issues, hyperactivity, severe language impairments, and notably elevated levels of aggression.
It's generational damage.
The tragedy here is generational, yes. The damage done to the fetal brain structure is largely permanent, and there are no documented clinical therapeutics to reverse it. You are treating the developmental symptoms for the rest of the child's life.
That is incredibly bleak. So what does this all mean for the practitioner? We've covered the staggering epidemiology, the brutal cellular mechanics, and the catastrophic clinical manifestations. As a clinician, how do you actually diagnose and treat this when the patient is sitting in front of you?
It requires a major shift in how you assess a patient.
Right, so let me pose a clinical dilemma. Imagine you are on shift in A&E. A 14-year-old is brought in. They're highly agitated, they have ataxia stumbling around, they are confused and slurring their words. You suspect substance misuse, so you order a routine toxicology screen.
Standard protocol.
Right, and it comes back completely clean. Negative for alcohol, negative for amphetamines, opiates, benzos, cannabis. Everything is negative. What is the clinical reasoning here? How do you think like a psychiatrist in this moment?
This is the exact moment where clinical acumen has to override a blind reliance on standard laboratory tests.
Okay.
You have to understand the physical limitations of your diagnostic tools. Standard toxicology screens, whether urine or serum, are entirely useless for detecting volatile hydrocarbons.
You just don't pick them up?
They simply do not look for them. Furthermore, these substances have incredibly short half-lives in the blood. They volatilize and exit the body rapidly via respiration. Therefore, a clean tox screen in an obviously intoxicated, ataxic adolescent should not lead you to conclude they are sober.
Right.
It should immediately raise your index of suspicion for inhalant use.
So if the lab can't tell you what's going on, what are you looking for on the physical exam and in the clinical history?
You have to become an investigator. You rely heavily on collateral information. Ask the parents, the peers, or the paramedics. Did they find aerosol pans, plastic bags, or solvent-soaked rags in the child's bedroom?
Look for the ordinary items.
Exactly. Physically, you have to get close and you smell the patient's breath and clothing for distinct chemical odors. Paint, glue, petrol. You examine the skin around the mouth and nose for the classic glue sniffer's rash.
Let's define that. A papular rash, right?
Yes, a perioral or perinasal papular rash. Papular just means it's a rash made up of small, raised, solid bumps. It's an inflammatory contact dermatitis caused by the direct caustic contact of the organic solvents with the delicate skin around the mouth and nose.
That makes sense.
You also look for paint or marker residue on the hands, under the fingernails, or on the face.
Now, I know there's a specific laboratory test mentioned in the literature, measuring the ratio of hippuric acid to creatinine in the urine. Hippuric acid is a direct metabolite of toluene, but clinical experts are also highly critical of this test in a real-world setting.
Very critical, yes.
Why is it practically useless for routine day-to-day monitoring?
It's a matter of clinical pragmatism versus theoretical chemistry. Yes, the liver metabolizes absorbed toluene into benzyl alcohol, which is then excreted as hippuric acid in the urine. An elevated hippurate to creatinine ratio can definitively confirm recent toluene exposure.
So theoretically, it works.
Theoretically. However, practically, the test is deeply flawed for active monitoring in a treatment program. First, the detection window is very short, often just a few days. Second, it's not perfectly specific. Certain foods containing high levels of benzoates can actually cause false positives.
Really? Just from food?
Yes. Third, and most importantly, for a chronically underfunded treatment program, it requires specialized gas chromatography and mass spectroscopy. Sending this test out takes a week to get results and costs the equivalent of almost 2 days' worth of a patient's intensive day treatment reimbursement.
Oh, wow. So it's just not viable.
It is far too slow and too expensive to be used for the kind of random, frequent monitoring required in adolescent substance use treatment. You have to rely on clinical observation and behavioral monitoring.
Okay, so through investigation, you've established they are using inhalants. Now you have to make the formal diagnosis of inhalant use disorder and, crucially, unpick it from the comorbidities. How do you separate the symptoms of chronic inhalant use from, say, an underlying conduct disorder or antisocial personality disorder.
This is one of the most challenging differential diagnoses in adolescent psychiatry.
Because they look so similar.
Exactly. You have a patient acting destructively and impulsively. Are they acting this way because their frontal lobes are currently bathed in toluene, or are they using toluene because they have an underlying conduct disorder that drives extreme risk-taking and rule-breaking?
Right. How do you untangle that?
You have to establish a meticulous timeline. Did the antisocial behavior predate the initiation of inhalant use by years? Does the severe aggression or rule-breaking persist during documented periods of confirmed abstinence? If the antisocial behavior only occurs during intoxication or the immediate aftermath, it's likely a manifestation of the substance. If it's a persistent baseline trait across all environments, you are looking at a dual diagnosis.
And what about these severe psychiatric phenotypes that inhalants can induce? Things like inhalant-induced psychotic disorder, anxiety disorder, and delirium.
The diagnostic manuals are very clear here. You only render these specific diagnoses if the psychiatric symptoms, the hallucinations, the profound panic attacks, or the severe cognitive disturbances exceed what you would expect from standard intoxication and are severe enough to warrant independent clinical attention.
Got it.
For instance, if the paranoia and auditory hallucinations persist for several days after the physical intoxication has cleared, that is an inhalant-induced psychotic disorder. That is a significant clinical event, often requiring acute, targeted management.
Which brings us to perhaps the most difficult part of this deep dive, treatment. In modern addiction medicine, we're used to having pharmacological safety nets. We have methadone and buprenorphine for opioids. We have acamprosate and naltrexone for alcohol. What is the pharmacologic cure? The medication-assisted treatment for inhalants?
There isn't one.
Nothing.
There is absolutely no established FDA-approved agonist or antagonist therapy for inhalant use disorder. There is no patch, no pill, no substitute. And more importantly, there is a massive, strictly enforced contraindication that every single clinician must burn into their memory.
Let's emphasize this, because this could literally be a matter of life and death in an emergency setting. What must a clinician never do when presented with an acutely intoxicated, highly anxious, or agitated inhalant user?
You must never administer sedative drugs, specifically benzodiazepines.
No benzos.
Never. It is a very common, almost instinctual reflex in emergency medicine or acute psychiatry. A patient is agitated, panicked, perhaps showing signs of aggression or withdrawal, so you give them a benzodiazepine like lorazepam or diazepam to calm them down and protect the staff.
Right, standard de-escalation in a lot of settings.
Exactly. But if you do this to an active inhalant user, you could kill them. Remember the mechanism of action we discussed. Inhalants are potent GABA-positive allosteric modulators and NMDA antagonists. They are massive CNS depressants. Benzodiazepines operate on that exact same GABA pathway.
Oh, no.
If you add a benzo to a brain already saturated with toluene, you will dramatically potentiate the CNS depression, creating a fatal synergy. This leads rapidly to respiratory suppression, coma, and death.
That is a critical clinical pearl. Do not add a depressant to a depressant. But if they're severely and dangerously agitated, perhaps acutely psychotic and posing a risk to themselves, what is the alternative if benzos are off the table?
If the agitation presents a severe, unmanageable safety risk to the patient or staff, you might cautiously manage it with a dopamine receptor antagonist, such as haloperidol. But generally, the frontline treatment for acute intoxication is supportive care.
Just keeping them safe.
You want to provide a calm, quiet, reassuring, low-stimulus environment. Why? Because you want to prevent adrenaline spikes and avoid triggering sudden sniffing death. You keep them calm, you monitor their vitals, and you wait for the short half-life of the solvent to clear their system.
So if there's no magic pill to cure the addiction, what does long-term treatment actually look like? I know the literature mentions some intriguing preclinical research like using minocycline in rats to prevent neuroinflammation and memory impairment, but that's a long way from the clinic.
It is a very long way off. The minocycline research is fascinating because it targets the neuroinflammatory cascade and the oxidative stress we talked about, but current clinical care relies entirely on comprehensive biopsychosocial treatment models.
Because there's no chemical fix.
Exactly. Because the biological evidence base is so limited, Treatment must be holistic and psychosocially aggressive. You have to actively treat the comorbid conditions, the ADHD, the PTSD, the mood disorders that are driving the desire to escape in the first place.
You have to fix the environment.
Yes, you have to engage in intense family therapy because, as we discussed, the familial ecosystem is often deeply fractured or neglectful. And fundamentally, you are aiming for total long-term abstinence.
Can the brain heal from that level of white matter destruction?
Well, the young brain possesses remarkable neuroplasticity, and some studies suggest that long-term abstinence can allow for some degree of neurologic recovery, though the extent of that recovery is often tragically limited by the sheer volume of white matter destroyed during those crucial adolescent developmental years.
It requires an immense amount of patience, comprehensive care, and frankly, social support that many of these patients simply don't have. All right, let's synthesize this massive amount of clinical data and distill it down into our core takeaways before we test out some clinical reasoning.
I would distill it into 5 core pillars. First, inhalants are everyday, highly accessible, volatile compounds that cross the blood-brain barrier almost instantaneously. Due to their lipophilic nature, they preferentially target and accumulate in the lipid-rich white matter of the central nervous system.
Right.
Second, pharmacodynamically, they act primarily as profound CNS depressants. They achieve this by antagonizing excitatory NMDA receptors and potentiating inhibitory GABA receptors.
And the brake and accelerator.
Exactly. Third, the medical dangers are both acute and chronic. Acutely, the most terrifying risk is sudden sniffing death caused by the sensitization of the myocardium to endogenous catecholamines. Chronically, they cause profound leukoencephalopathy, massive organ failure, and in pregnant users, fetal solvent syndrome, which closely mimics FASD.
Got it.
Fourth, diagnosis relies heavily on clinical acumen. You will often see clean tox screens, so you must look for physical clues like chemical odors and perioral rashes rather than relying on rapid lab tests.
And the final one.
And finally, treatment requires holistic psychosocial intervention. Crucially, clinicians must avoid administering cross-depressants like benzodiazepines during intoxication or agitation to prevent fatal respiratory suppression.
Excellent summary. Now, let's put this knowledge into practice. We're going to run through some organic clinical scenarios just to see how these concepts actually play out on the ward. Let's think through these together.
Let's do it.
Let's imagine our first scenario.
Yeah.
You're on shift in A&E. A 14-year-old is brought in, highly agitated, slurring his words and exhibiting a very unsteady gait. You run a standard urine tox screen and it comes back completely negative. But you smell a faint chemical odor on his collar. What is the neurochemical reality of what's happening in his brain right now to cause this depressant effect?
Okay, so in this scenario, you are looking at a classic inhalant intoxication. The neurochemical reality is a dual mechanism: positive allosteric modulation of GABA receptors and non-competitive inhibition of NMDA receptors.
Yeah.
If a clinician is struggling to understand the presentation, they must recall the pharmacodynamics. The inhalant is simultaneously boosting the brain's primary inhibitory signals, GABA, and blocking the primary excitatory signals, glutamate, via the NMDA receptor. That's why he is stumbling and slurring despite a clean tox screen for alcohol.
Right. Taking the foot off the gas and slamming the emergency brake. Okay, next scenario. A teenager is caught huffing butane behind a school. A teacher startles him by shouting. The teenager jumps up to run, takes 2 steps, and collapses in sudden cardiac arrest. Why did a startle response kill him?
This is the absolute tragedy of sudden sniffing death. The primary mechanism responsible is the sensitization of the myocardium to endogenous catecholamines, like epinephrine.
Adrenaline.
Yes. The inhalant didn't stop his heart directly. It primed the heart muscle to be dangerously electrically unstable. The teacher's shouting caused a massive natural surge of adrenaline. The sensitized heart overreacted to that surge, leading instantly to a fatal ventricular arrhythmia.
It's an incredibly fragile state to be in. Let's look at diagnostics. A clinician strongly suspects a patient has been huffing toluene based on behavioral changes, but they want biological confirmation. What is the specific urine metabolite they could theoretically measure, even though we know it's practically limited in a real-world clinic?
The appropriate marker to measure is hippuric acid, specifically looking at the shipurate to creatinine ratio. Toluene is metabolized by the liver into benzyl alcohol and then excreted as hippuric acid.
Practically.
But again, a clinician must remember that while chemically accurate, this test is often too slow, too costly, and has too short a detection window for routine, real-time clinical monitoring.
Okay, here is a critical one for acute management. An adolescent intoxicated on an unknown inhalant is experiencing severe panic and physical agitation in the clinic. They are thrashing around. A nurse suggests giving them a standard dose of lorazepam to calm them down. Why must you immediately stop that nurse?
You stop them because benzodiazepines are strictly contraindicated. Because inhalants are potent GABAergic drugs. Adding a benzodiazepine like lorazepam creates a deadly synergistic effect.
We're just adding a depressant to a depressant.
Exactly. You are massively increasing the risk of fatal respiratory and CNS depression. If pharmacological intervention is absolutely necessary for safety, cautious use of a dopamine antagonist like haloperidol is the preferred route.
Good to know. Let's talk about the long-term neuroimaging. A patient with a 5-year history of chronic toluene misuse undergoes an MRI due to severe cognitive decline and ataxia. What is the radiologist most likely to see regarding volume loss?
The radiologist will see profound volume loss in the lipid-rich white matter, manifesting as leukoencephalopathy and demyelination. Because toluene is highly lipophilic, it dissolves into and destroys the fatty myelin sheaths insulating the brain's neural networks.
Leaving all those empty spaces.
Yes. This leads to a total loss of white-gray matter differentiation on the scan and profound dementia-like cognitive decline.
Final scenario. A pregnant patient with a severe ongoing inhalant use disorder gives birth. The infant presents with a hypoplastic midface, microcephaly, and clear developmental delays. What other substance does this teratogenic presentation most closely mimic, and why?
The presentation most closely mimics the teratogenic effects of alcohol. This is fetal solvent syndrome, and it closely resembles fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, or FASD.
Because the mechanisms are so similar.
Exactly. The reason for the clinical overlap is that both solvents and alcohol share very similar neuropharmacological profiles, specifically regarding NMDA antagonism and GABA modulation. These specific receptor interactions are devastating to the architecture of the developing fetal brain.
Fantastic clinical reasoning. If any of those scenarios felt tricky, I highly encourage you to go back and review the mechanisms in the literature. As we wrap up, I want to leave you with a final provocative thought to mull over. We've spent this entire deep dive mapping the terrifying neurotoxicity of these chemicals. We've talked about lipid peroxidation, receptors, and brain atrophy.
It's heavy material.
It is. But the true tragedy of inhalants is that they represent an intersection of chemical neurobiology and profound societal neglect. When you have a 12-year-old child seeking escape in a tin of paint thinner, the failure is not just occurring in the child's dopamine circuitry or their myelin sheaths.
No, it's not.
The failure is in the environment that made that tin of solvent the most accessible, affordable form of relief they could find. It forces every clinician to look past the symptom, look past the clean talk screen, and ask, are we just treating a chemical exposure, or are we treating the symptom of a deeply fractured social ecosystem?
It is the essential psychiatric question. You cannot separate the mind from the brain, and you cannot separate the brain from the environment it develops within.
Very true.
Thank you for joining us on this exploration. Please remember that this deep dive is a companion to your studies, designed to synthesize and illuminate the material, but it is not a replacement for reading the primary text.
Here are the details of this episode.
Inhalant-related disorders. Byline. Some substances hide in plain sight, not behind locked doors, but under kitchen sinks, in garages, classrooms, and bedrooms.